Thank you, thank you.
So, welcome.
Thank you.
I was delighted that you could join us because there's so many things that I wanted to be able to talk to you about in this room. We're going to talk about your career. We're going to talk about where journalism stands today.
That part's not good.
That part's not good.
The journalism part's kind of the depressing part, I think.
Well, then let's jump in and start with that. What's your view on?
Actually, I really believe journalism is going to go through a very trying time and come out the other side. Most journalists I know feel like we're being tested, and I think being tested is actually sometimes a good thing. I think people are fighting for the thing that they got into journalism for. So ultimately, I actually think it's going to have a positive outcome. But yeah, it's kind of a messy times. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's just messy and sometimes very ugly.
Well, you've been on the inside of a lot of newsrooms, NBC, CNN, and now you have your own show that you do from Washington. Mm-hmm. Every week. So right now you have an interesting perspective because you're not in the Washington press corps exactly, but you're involved in it. So first of all, do you wish you were more
No, I've never.
The daily?
Whenever I've done shows, I've never been part of that daily briefing, and I actually don't think it's necessarily a good way to get information. And I actually think sometimes reporters blocked from getting good information sometimes become better reporters because
True.
I don't know that someone sort of delivering stuff to you, and in this case, we know that the president himself and Sean Spicer often as his spokesperson give very flawed to be charitable, wrong to be less charitable, lies to be really less charitable. I mean, they just sometimes make stuff up. That's just a fact. So I think you're not necessarily going to be in there taking notes and saying, oh, this is great, I can go out with this for my story. You actually have to report. And so no, I've never had any interest in being in the briefing room ever.
Well, maybe not the briefing room, but you have it in the anchor chair.
Yeah.
And anchors are sometimes being the subject of very personal attacks right now. Entire news organizations, particularly the Clinton News Network, is being targeted. Do you think that this, and then we have this whole
But I don't
problem.
know that, I mean, I think when you're being targeted and you know you're chasing after stories, it's like, I must be doing something right. Right? I mean, it's,
right.
I have a million friends who work at CNN, and they don't call me crying like, oh my God, they mentioned us. I think it means, I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing for them, and I think they feel more committed to journalism than ever before.
So then why do you think it's a messy or bad time for journalism right now?
Just because it's hard, right? I mean, I think that you have a public that actually is really struggling to distinguish between, sort of fake news and real news mm-hmm. and data points and alternative data points. And so I think it's really not about the people you're covering, it's more about an audience that has been very, I think, challenging when they don't believe, basic facts. I think that part is really hard, and I don't think that's necessarily a fast fix. And I actually think journalists have some complicity in that because I think we've had a lot of. A good example would be when my CNN breaking news came out across many years ago now that said that Jennifer Lawrence got a haircut. You guys remember that? Did you get this CNN breaking news brief?
No.
Jennifer Lawrence had her haircut. So at some point, I'm being a little facetious, that's true though, but you can't sort of claim all these things and then expect everybody to suddenly believe you when you've spent a lot of time not necessarily taking your journalism very seriously. So I think there is a bit of a backlash. And a good example, when you look at these political panels, I mean, there was a time when political panels were full of people who, regardless of what side of the aisle they were on, they had some experience, right? I mean, nothing more fascinating than talking to someone who ran something for Richard Nixon or had, Gerald Ford's chief of staff, whatever. It was less about their politics and more about, so what's the process now? It's the night before State of the Union. What is happening? What kind of advice are they getting? Oh, this crisis has happened. Tell me, what goes on mm-hmm. in the Oval Office? Who needs to be in the room? How does that work? Mm-hmm. I find those conversations fascinating. But now these panels have just become very people who are just partisan and actually just willing to say often just crazy shit. So that's what's going to get you on television. I mean, it's going to get you sort of elevated. And I think, we bear responsibility for that. We have created sort of monsters off of people who literally have no experience, have never served in an administration, but they're willing to say stuff.
Who do you have in mind when you're thinking about this? Oh, no, I'm serious.
There's a bunch. And I won't name them, but you all know who I'm talking about. I mean, really, they're often young. They're often, if they're representing Trump, blonde, and 20 or something.
Right.
And so, I mean, it's less about who they are individually and more about who sort of lack of experience. And I think actually on the left as well, right? You've got these talking heads who didn't run someone's campaign, who don't have a lot of value to add in terms of filling you in, whether you agree with their position or not.
And they're being paid to have a certain point of view on the program.
But the fact that their point of view is sort of over the top and they're willing to say something crazy is why they're on, right? You give them a spot. Listen, at one point I went on CNN actually and said, you guys have had white supremacists on. Like, you literally have elevated the voices of white supremacists. That's what you have done. Unchallenged, right? And these are people, by the way, not who I think are white supremacists, who have self-identified as white supremacists. I think that's a problem. And I think you lose some of your credibility when you do that. So don't be surprised when there are large swaths of people who start not believing the things that you have to say. I think journalism is supposed to be about serving people and helping people navigate lots of complicated information. And so that, for me, is what makes the time tricky. It's the audiences who really are challenged.
Well, I think it wasn't the tendency toward extreme commentary on cable news a function of A, Fox News' success, and B, the splintering of the audience, and so the need to kind of stick out and say something that's going to really make people tune in, because there's not 3 broadcast network news, and nobody watches the broadcast network news anymore.
Many more people watch the broadcast network news.
Numerically, but nobody who you know.
Right, numerically, but a large swath of people who actually have the money, right? So there are people who watch broadcast network news. It predates this sort of latest go-around. I remember I worked at MSNBC, right? And Bill Clinton was being impeached. We said the word blowjob on television all the time. I remember, like, the first time was kind of weird. Yeah. The 200th time. But part of that was you have a ball in the air, your show lasts 4 hours, you just got to keep it going. So yeah, but this has actually been going on for a long time.
Okay, so let me go back. Are you critiquing yourself and saying you should have pushed back at that time?
I think that I didn't really understand where it was going, and I do think that the value is actually one of the reasons that I didn't do it for very long. I just didn't enjoy it. Like, you have a bunch of people around a circle all sort of gabbing until you get to the next thing. They actually did a parody of the show that I was on, and on SNL, and in the parody, somebody says, the host says, so the show is called, Fish or Cut Bait, and they had 4 people, and they're like, so tell me, fish or cut bait? And I think one of the guests says, well, I think, and the person's like, no, fish or cut bait? And they're like, fish? And the next person says, cut bait. And the other person says, fish. Thank you for coming. They go into it was but the joke, and that was of that time, the joke was, of course, that it doesn't really matter what you're talking about as long as you get to that punchline fast. So my point is, this has actually gone on for a very long time. It was really what made me decide that I wanted to do longer form, that I was much more interested in more complex storytelling, and that I never again would do panel type shows where I wasn't running it and I wasn't picking the direction of the conversation, because I think you can do them well. Doing them like that, I don't think is smart.
Well, we're only doing more of that now, actually. We're not doing less of that.
But you could do more and stuff them with people who have something compelling and thoughtful to say. It's more the, picking people who just want to make news.
So then how do we fix what's wrong with journalism, which has gotten us, follow your analysis, to the state where people don't believe what they see on television, and where we have now literally an open war between the commander-in-chief and the media. And
He's
by
got
the
an
way,
open
it's
war
like,
with a lot of people, so I'm
he's
not,
in well, yes, but to sit there and call the media liars, or to call out when he won't call
a lot of presidents had a problem with the media, and Barack Obama was,
more presidents than not.
absolutely, and President Obama was not so open with having the media come. I mean, he certainly didn't call us enemies, the American people, but he really actually did push back hard on the media and did not like the media, and was very selective about who he would go and talk to. So I always resist sort of the narrative around, like, oh my God, this has never happened before, that a president hates the media, where that's just not
right,
true.
but the veneer of civility has been ripped away,
for everything in the country, for sure. We're at a very challenging time, I think, in the country as a whole. Well, so here's what I think is part of the solution. We're starting a project, the production company that I started when I left CNN about 3 years ago, formed around what works. Because one of the things that I wanted to do is, people would say, so how do you get people to trust the media? And it always reminds me of when you're dating someone and they're like, you can trust me, baby. You're like, like, run from that person, that's a terrible person. You really need to just be trustworthy, right? You just need to go do a good job. One way to do that is take the politics, I think, out of some of the reporting. And so, for example, we're looking at a project where you can just go and find projects that have worked. One of the reasons people believe government sucks is because a lot of our reporting is government sucks all the time, right? So don't be stunned when everyone in America, or a large percentage, think government sucks. There are actually a lot of programs and projects, some government funded, some not, that work really well, that are really, really successful, that actually are measured. There's tons of data, could be scaled, and could be replicated in places around the country and around the globe. So what if you, in fact, went very local, and you looked at projects that worked? And if I can share one.
Please.
So Johnson County, Kansas, they realized that there are 250 people who were using resources in the county jail and the emergency room, to the point of $90,000 per person, because in the jail, because they would come back 3 days at a time in the jail. So they decided to do a deep dive into the data of these 250 people, and what they found, at $90K each, what they found was that part of the problem was the way things were being processed. The police had no other options. So, drunk person that there's causing a problem outside of a bar, that person has to go to jail. There's no other place to take them. So instead, they created this facility, and they had beds. Drunk people now slept it off. In the morning, they'd get up and they'd walk out.
Right.
Free. Then you had some people who clearly had mental illness. Same thing. They were being, the police would come in. What could they do with them? They put them into jail, which is exactly where you should not be if you have a mental illness. So now in the same facility, they were able to have an intake system, right? And those people got processed through in ways that would be helpful to them, so they would get connected to mental health services. Big saving in money. And also, the police no longer had to do something that they really weren't, in the jail, had to deal with something they weren't really, created to do. They found that their emergency room numbers were still really high. And so, again, deep dive into the data, they recognized that some people who had contusions, sometimes they were drunk and fell, or sometimes there was some kind of melee, whatever, they had to go to the emergency room. Well, if you go through the emergency room, the officer needs to sit with you, and we all know an emergency room wait is about 8 hours, so the cop sits with you for 8 hours in the ER, waste of his or her time, waste of the person who has a minor injury, still has to be checked out. Put a healthcare provider in this facility, and now the cop's total time of drop-offs was 15 minutes. So huge savings. They save $250,000 a year, right? That's not political. I don't know if the mayor is a Republican or a Democrat or an independent. It's irrelevant. What happened was they lowered costs. They created something that helped the community. A lot of people were happy, and you could scale that anywhere. And so my feeling is, what if you started doing storytelling around just what works? what works, and elevate the people who are coming up with interesting solutions to problems that exist everywhere. Couldn't San Diego do that same thing, maybe with tweaks? Couldn't they have a platform where that data can be shared?
Are you saying these are the stories you want to
So
tell?
we started a project called What Works Media, which is under Starfish, and we're in the process of getting funding for it. And what our company does, what I think our difference is that we're all about being across every platform. So when you work at CNN, you do pieces for CNN, and that's where everything you do lives. Every deal we do now is completely non-exclusive. So all of our content lives everywhere. So we will do a piece for the news hour, let's say, which runs about 10 minutes, cut it down for WebMD, which runs about 4 minutes, find another digital partner, do something for Huffington Post, write op-eds, also hang on to own all the content. So if we need to repurpose that content in any way, shape, or form, because we ran it through our production company, we own it all, and you just can use it over and over and over again as whatever you want.
That is a very interesting new model, by the way, that not very many people in news have tried, which is having an independent content creation that is not owned by CNN or owned by
I think the
NBC
key
News.
is to not. So we get funders who understand the value of journalistic pieces, who say, wow, I'd like to fund this project. I'd also like, at some point, something to live on my own website. I'd love to figure out how we can do a branded content deal and support issues that I care about. And this is really happening at the same time that media isn't really covering some of these stories. You know, whenever I go, we have a series that's airing on PBS NewsHour at the end of the month, and
About what?
Veterans and the brain science around PTSD. And so it was so interesting when we would go to people to think about funding. I would say to them, but no one's doing stories on veterans. Let me tell you how a veteran will be covered. When someone shoots their wife, everybody will run and stand outside their house and say, and you know, he was a veteran. So is this really, you care about this issue deeply. Is this, but I'm telling you, as you all would agree, this is how this story will be covered. Is that what you're interested in? And they'd say, no, we really should find ways to do great journalistic projects. So they funded a multi-part series. And that multi-part series will go to PBS NewsHour. We'll have some digital arm of it, again, goes to WebMD, which has some ridiculously large number of viewers. Huffington Post gets a piece of it with embedded content. I'll go on MSNBC to do some discussion around it, and it lives across a number of platforms.
Well, one way that it feels to me that some of the most important journalism is getting done is in documentary filmmaking, because the cable news networks have given up doing a lot of primary reporting instead of doing the horse race or the political story, whatever is driving the ratings. We had a great documentary filmmaker here last night, Larissa Rhodes. I know Katie Couric, who used to be on broadcast TV, is now doing these documentaries on the side because they are things that she's passionate about, whether it's guns or something else. Is that
Yeah, we have a bunch. We have 4 docs in production right now. But
also,
again,
so you're doing every kind of content.
And I tell people, if this lives as a doc for you only, then we have not done our jobs.
Really?
Absolutely. Because you know why? My 16-year-old daughter will never watch your doc. She just won't. She doesn't love docs. She doesn't, sit on Netflix.
So you're doing like a Snapchat
Absolutely. We absolutely have. Are there 6 important issues that we want to get out? And yeah, maybe you can do some kind of Snapchat content. You certainly can do a digital series.
Right.
You absolutely can do some reporting on it. You definitely want it to live on Facebook in some capacity. Sure, but if I've just did a doc and I say, oh my God, I hope you come to my screening tonight, I have failed you. I have failed you. It has to be much more than that, because people are getting their information in so many other ways, and audiences are all over the place. So not everybody's going to watch your doc. And I think if the material is amazing, and that's why you have to own it, right? Because you need to say, no, I own this. I'm going to give it to Snapchat. I own it. I'm going to do this project over here. If you don't own it, then you're doing these complicated joint venture deals, which can be very messy.
So if you were giving advice, and I know you gave advice because you mentored today, thank you
I had so much
for that.
fun. Where's my mentor, my mentees?
Mentees,
Did we
I
have a
saw
good,
them.
we had a good table. It was fun. We got a lot done.
Yeah, I mean, so what are you telling young journalists? Because you're able to do this because you have 20 years of
Yeah,
really
no, I think
hardcore news
really
experience.
building your resume is very important. I was able to start a company right away because I had a good name. And I was very careful about always doing really good work, even if it meant pushing back on people. I mean, when we did Black in America, some of it was so crazy, just so crazy. Where you just argue with people all the time. Or it just, nobody likes that person who's always raising the issue of like, I think this is an inappropriate way to refer to black people. I feel like maybe we shouldn't do that. Maybe we want to not say this about Latinos. It gets so old. It's so exhausting.
That's what happened to you
Oh
on,
my
on
gosh,
making that
all
series.
the time. Black in America. We did a documentary where we were doing a story on a guy who's a principal, Steve Perry, and a young woman who we followed as part of the doc. Glorious was her name. And the producer did the first pass of the script, and the script said, Glorious's mother is a crack addict and her father is an alcoholic. And I was like, so this seems not like how we should introduce this girl. She's 18 and is really not her story.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, and by the way, if Glorious were a 12-year-old white boy in suburban New Jersey, I'll tell you how we would have introduced him. Little Jimmy Smith is 12 years old. He loves baseball, and Derek Jeter is his favorite player. Every summer, he gets a paper route so that he can buy a glove that's been sitting at the store that he wants so badly. When he finally bought it, he put it under his mattress, to soften it up because blah, 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 blah. Right? I mean, that's how we would do that story. But when you deal with, yes, it's so true. When you deal with people of color, and especially I think people in poverty, right? Suddenly they become this mass of all their dysfunction, right? So, and code words that journalists love to use. They live in the ghetto. They are, at risk. And so often, I have to explain this idea of asset framing, which is what we do for a little boy, and deficit framing, what we do for people. And once you tell them, like, you can't deficit frame everybody, right? Wrap them in the list of things that are terrible in their life. I don't think we should at all pretend that Glorious has an amazing life. But she gets her own story. She's a human being, and we're not going to dehumanize her by make her the sum parts of some other people's dysfunction. That's unfair. But it's a fight all the time. And then you become a crazy person, right? Because you're very sensitized to it. So yeah, it was very, very challenging. But I actually think those arguments were helpful to me in my career. And certainly now it gave me a lot of confidence when I started the company to really know editorially what I wanted to do. I mean, growing a company and creating a company was very challenging. But editorially, I really was very clear on. So I had made a lot of mistakes coming up in my career and had a lot of wins. And I really was very strong coming out on that.
That's fantastic. We're out of time because I think we're speaking of deficit definition, I think we've gone deficit on the time, and we have a fantastic panel we want to bring on afterwards. Soledad, thank you so much for speaking.
It was my pleasure. Thank you.